Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video we're going to be making a dovetail alignment jig. Hope you enjoy. So to make this dovetail alignment board, I've got some scraps here already planed up ready to go, and another little piece here which is going to be the fence on it. I'll be using dovetails to actually put these two boards together. So there's a few things you can do when you come to actually glue them together to make sure they're square, and obviously that's using a square if you've already got one. So let me bring you in here and we'll get started on marking out our dovetails. So the first step is to get your tail board, which I'm going to be using this one for here. We're going to sit it on top of this just to use this as a flat reference. And if you have one of these wheel style gauges, you can get your thickness of your board from this. So we can get the thickness of this board down to here, referencing off there, lock it down, and that's going to be the thickness that goes onto our pin board. So we can mark that all the way around our pin board. So now we need to get the thickness of our pin board onto our dovetail board as well, because that's how thick our dovetails are going to be. So we go the other way around. Make sure you're holding it down because this one's longer. It's got a little gap back here, so it's going to fall down, so I'm just keeping pressure here. Push that down, hook it off. So now we've got that thickness of board here, and we can run that around. Make sure you get the correct side, correct end of your board, and we'll now run these dovetails all the way around on here. Now this is going to be my dovetail board, as I mentioned before, and what I'm going to do is just do two big dovetails on this. We don't need a lot of dovetails, we don't need extra strength. We're not going for some aesthetic look, unless you really want to practice your dovetails, in which case you could definitely do more. But I'm just going to go for a really quick, rough and basic layout here, and we're not even going to use dividers or anything because we're just doing two. We can work it out quite easily, just using the chisel that we're going to use to actually chisel the board. What we're going to do is take our chisel like this, and we're going to put it in that mark out line, and I'm going to put a mark, so we're going to deepen this, and we can see that's widened it. But I'm also just going to put a little pencil nick at the edge there so I know where my chisels come to. So you can actually use your chisel to lay out like this. You can mark it directly in there if you can see the mark, or just hold it lightly on the surface. So we're going to reference this side, so that's both our pins marked. Now, to get our center pin, so we need to work out how wide this is. It's 120 millimeters, so I'm going on 60 millimeters. Now we're going to halfway line the chisel up on that mark. Bring it up. You can push the chisel in deeper if you can see the marks. On some of these light woods you can. And we're just going to put a mark either side of that. So now we've got our layout lines here, and we're going to run these lines up to this edge just here. So we obviously need some sort of angle to mark our dovetails. Now if we look over here, I've got a couple of dovetail jigs, 1 and 6 and 1 and 8. I just tend to use the 1 and 6. It's a steeper angle. I use that for everything. I do sometimes use this in harder woods if I'm looking more aesthetic to have a lesser angle, but generally I just use 1 and 6. 1 and 7's fine. I know Paul Sellers likes 1 and 7, but 1 and 6 is what we're going to be using right now. For this, I'm going to use my marking knife. Find the line, push it up against, make sure it's referenced right flat on the front here, on the edge of your board. And if you've got one of these pointed ones, keep it flat. If you're using a double bevel one like this, you need to angle your knife away to make sure you get a nice flat line. Then we move across to our mark over here. And I do realise that this is actually sitting on a little bit of a a blemish here on the wood, so it's going to be a little bit difficult, but the line is right on the edge there. I can see it. It might be a little difficult. Then what we do is we flip it over the other way, do the same thing, and right over on the edge of the board here. Hold it nice and tight, like before, and do our mark. Now, I'm just going to pencil these in for you. There's our dovetails marked in there, there's the pin. So we're going to mark that pins there as waste. This is right on the edge of this piece, so you can't actually see that because of that blemish, but it's not really going to affect the final product. But as you can see, tail 1, tail 2. Now what we have to do is transfer those tail boards across onto the top and down on the other side, so we've got references when we cut. Some people don't mark the back side of the board. I like to mark it just in case, and it just makes it a little bit easier as a beginner to actually get that mark and make sure that you're nice and square with your cut off your saw. And the most important thing when it comes to cutting dovetails is that you're actually square along. The angle doesn't matter because you're transferring that to your pins. It's the square part that really matters. So you can use a big square like this to mark these across if you want. Make sure you're coming off your reference face when doing this. Now, because I've used the marking knife, I can actually bring my knife along and I'll snap into the gap so I know exactly where it is. It's right on that edge there. That. Make sure you're making your lines in the right direction. So now we're ready. We're going to move this into the vise and start cutting our dovetails. So when doing this, what I forgot to mention is obviously we're going to use a dovetail saw. This one here is just a gent saw. And you can also use this style, which is the Japanese style, which I've been using a bit. So it's up to you which one you're going to use. I'm probably just going to use the gent saw since I'm most experienced with this saw. And at this stage, I'm just trialing this one. What we're going to do is take a lot of care to make sure that we've actually got this square across at the top. Now, there are a bunch of jigs you can get for this, and I don't tend to use them. You can use a square like this, so you can establish, and then you can actually bring a square up against it, or you're just following your line and taking the reliance on your line you've got on the top here. So you nibble across, follow that line, and we can come back in and double check that we've got that correct, and it's pretty close. Now, some people like to leave the line. When you've got a marking gauge, I like to just go straight on top of it, because I find that's going to get you the most accuracy, because you shouldn't have to chisel off a saw when cutting dovetails. You usually have to chisel with the pins a little bit, but with the tails you shouldn't have to. While I'm in the groove of establishing these curves nice and square, we're going to just establish each one, and if we're a little bit off, we can just correct it before we saw the rest of it. We can see here that we're going to have to follow these angles here. So we've got the little deviations just here. I don't know if you can see it. There's just the little marks that we've done with the saw. Now everything is just following that angle because we know we're square. So we follow that and just angle the saw and then stop right on that baseline just there. So you can bring it up or down a little bit in your vise if you're getting vibration from your saw. You can also put wax on your saw if that's going to help you. So obviously you bring your saw back in here, and now you're trying to get that angle. So you've got to eyeball that line. Now, once you've got that straight across, I like to just angle on my side down a little bit to follow that line because that's where your reference is. So this is where you can see your line, and this is why you don't need to mark that outer edge. And of course this angle doesn't matter so much. So now that we're down here, we can come back up, and the rest of the saw is just going to follow that curve you've already got. Right down to your baseline. Now you want to make sure that you have actually made it to your baseline, but you don't really want to go over your baseline. That's why I find it's important to have your baseline marked on both sides. Similarly on this side, except we're angling the other way now. And like that. Now, to remove our pins here, obviously you can bring your saw in on the side here to deal with these two end pins. And this one, there's a couple of ways. You can just chisel it straight out, or you can remove the waste with a coping saw first and then chisel it out. So let's move on. We'll remove these two side bits and then get on with removing that middle pin. Make sure you're square. You can bring that square in again like this. And then we can just come back in here and we've popped that out. Now these surfaces should be all flat. If you need to, you can bring a chisel in to clean these edges up. In my case, it's just that little bit on the bottom of the tail. So when using the coping saw for this, normally you try and go to the bottom, but here I'm just going to go on an angle down to this corner here. So we still have this little bit of material on the bottom here that we now have to remove with a chisel. So let's go ahead and do that. So to do this, we're going to come in and we're going to chisel halfway in from both sides. Now, because I've still got quite a bit of material there, if I just hit this straight with the hammer, it's going to go over the baseline. So what I'm going to do is go halfway between that material and chisel that off first. So that's about halfway. Flip it over, halfway on that waste material. And now we've got that waste cleared out. So I'm going to go back to my face side because that's the side I like to start on. And because we marked this straight off the chisel, we can use that same chisel. Now, you can keep this deadbolt upright, but you're better off angling it forward a degree or two, so when you come in, you undercut in the center so you don't have a bulge in the center of your pin. So you'll still seat nice and clean on the outside, but you're undercutting the inner part of it. So halfway again. Over to the other side. Same thing. Angle it forward a bit. And there we go. We've chiseled that all out nicely on both sides. Everything's going to come into alignment nicely. We can check through here. You can see that that's flush through there. Coming on this side. Looks like we've undercut a little bit on this side here by accident with the saw. That's a pity. But the rest of this is all nicely lined up. And it's probably partially because of the referencing, but that's fine. As I said, you don't always get these things perfect. Now, one last thing we need to do, even though we've undercut that, we just need to clean that up a little bit. Just make sure that everything's cleaned up right into these two corners. They're the two that count. So now that we've done that, we can manually transfer obviously without any alignment this time, our tails over to our pin board, transfer our pins and cut out the tail material, and then try and bring this whole joint together. I'm going to use, obviously, my hand plane here, and we're going to put the tail board in to the, just in here. Now, what I'm doing is just lining it up flush with the top of my hand plane here, and that just means that when I reference it across, I've got something to lift it up onto. This brings the work a little bit up closer to you, but also allows you to keep it flat. So you bring the hand plane back like this, and we're going to bring it in, and we're going to align it in here the way we want to. Now, I'm aligning it to this side over here. You can use the back part of your chisel, because that should be flat. Referencing that right over, line your dovetails up with the edge of your board, like so. Reference this side once more, make sure it's flat, flush. So now comes the tricky part of marking this without moving it. Put pressure down on the top here, that stops it from moving. And then mark along your dovetails, hopefully without any of this moving. And if there's any discrepancies in your tails, you're going to pick that up here. Oh, I moved. This is what I didn't want. But because I've already got a reference line here, I can actually just line flat back up with that. Push that back here, flat. Like that. Put the pressure back on and just mark that again. There's our dovetails. Any square you've got, you might have to lift it a little higher depending on the size of your square. Once again, I like to use the knife to transfer these down. Pull that across. Line down. Now, it doesn't matter on this side if your lines go over the baseline, because this is going to be the outside and it's going to be hand planed. But if you can avoid it, it's probably best not to throw it too far past your baseline. So we want to mark our waist, so we know which side to stay on. So we can see that we've taken that material out, but we still need to square up the edge of these tails and make sure that we've got this completely flush on the bottom to bring them together. So let's just get this back in the vise and do a little bit of extra chiseling work, just a little bit of paring. We're looking to just clean up these dovetails. You can follow your line there, coming from both sides if need be. You can also bring the dovetail in first and just try to see how close your fit is. You can just come in here on these, because the dovetails are going to come together like this. This bit here is on the inside face and you're not going to see it, and it'll just help the dovetail come together a little easier. Now, you once again want this held nice and tight, and if you've got nice tight dovetails like these, you can feel they sort of start to come together. Now, you don't want to force them too much. If they're way too tight, you need to remove some more material off those tails first. Now this one does feel a little too tight. It's forcing this way as I'm trying to push it down. So I just need to take a little bit more just off this front edge, just on my side. Try and bring it together again. Dry fit. This one here has been undercut on that baseline, and we can fix that up, but since this is just a shop jig, we don't have to worry too much about that. So we don't need much glue when we do dovetails. Really, you just need it on the inside of these tails, on the inside of the dovetails, or you can put it straight on the pins. I prefer to put the glue straight on the pin edge here. So I'm just using a little bit of PVA, little spatula here. You really don't need a lot, but you want it to cover the whole lot, like this. Now, you can add a little bit along the bottom here. It's not really going to do a lot, but it will help to fill any little gaps that might be showing. Other than that, it's not really going to do a lot. But I do like just to add a little bit along there, like so. Now we're going to come again like this. Bring it together, tap it together. I mentioned a way that we can ensure that this is square using our square, so that's what we're going to do now. Now, I like to use my most accurate square for this, which is my combination. Bring that down so it's nice and flat. We're going to reference the long edge on the long side, and we're going to move that until we know that's nice and square. So we want to leave this to dry. So to make sure it doesn't adjust itself, I like to sit it in my vise like this, just double check again with a smaller square that we're still square, and leave it until it's dried. So while the dovetails dry and we can come back and hand plane and sort of square it all up, I'm going to make the fences that are going to sit on the side. Now these fences need to be thin enough that when you actually got your dovetail boards, or your thinnest dovetail boards, in your vise, you can actually still close your vise up so it doesn't bottom out on your fence. So 10 millimeters is about the thinnest that I use. So we'll take the thickness of the material that we're using and then the thinnest fence. On the top area it doesn't matter, but the one that goes down in the vise, that's the one that actually matters. This board is 20 millimeters, so I'm probably going to go about 25 millimeters for this fence. This board here is quite a short board. The fence doesn't actually need to be too long. You just don't want it to impede with any fence that's coming in here. So in this case, I think I'll probably make the fence about 100 mil long, like this. And now we have both our fences ready to attach. Now, our dovetails will be dry now, so let's move back there. We'll plane them so they're square on one side so we can align it. Make sure our dovetails are flush so our boards sit flat, and then we'll be good to attach our fences. When the hand plane comes in, it'll be supported on the board, and we want to just hand plane these tails off. I've got quite a fine set on the hand plane. So now I've hit the top of that first pin, and I've just hit the top of that pin. Alright, so I've hit the top of all those pins, which means that this is now flush. Now we want to do the same this way, but we're also going to hand plane in from this edge into it so we don't blow out this edge here. Here we can see that is actually pretty square right through. It might be out by a millimeter or less than a millimetre, a fraction of a millimetre, and that is not going to actually affect the alignment of your dovetail. This needs to be square and flush to this side here so we can align things properly. Now, in this case, obviously this board was a little bit wider than the other one, and I knew that at the time. So we just need to hand plane that until it comes flush with this side here, so that we can actually put our fences on here and have them in the same alignment. So to hold this so it's supported, I've got my little brass bench dog just here holding the back of that board, so as I push into it, it's supported. And I've got my wooden clamp holding this upright just so it doesn't move. Now, we have a very fine set on the hand plane. Now, I need that held a little bit higher up so it doesn't move as much. So I'm just going to lift that bench dog to get it to support a little bit higher up. We're now square this way, and we're all flat and flush through here now. So to attach these fences, we're obviously going to have one here and one here. Don't want them too close because you don't want to interfere with any marking that's going to go on here. But you also don't want it too far back, so when you're doing smaller materials, you can still get in there and mark them. So what I'm going to do is use some CA glue here to attach these. Run the medium CA here, just to speed this whole process up. We'll do one at a time. Got the activator, I'm going to run that along here. I'm going to align that there, flush with the bottom, and that one's done. Now this one, more activator. As this is a shop jig, you could put an oil or a paste wax finish on it if you wanted to. I prefer quite often to not finish anything that I use as a jig, especially stuff that's got wood contact, because the friction of the wood also means that your boards are not going to move around as much. It just means they're going to stay put a little bit more, especially if you're using something like a paste wax, which makes the surface slippery, or any film finish that does the same. So there you have it, folks. As you can see, this was a great beginner project. It's getting you to use some basics like your dovetails, and even if you made some mistakes like I did, since I haven't done dovetails in a while, it still didn't affect you making a effective jig that is square, because you're making sure that it's held square when it dries. So for the most part, it's great at honing your skills at doing dovetails, and in the process you're actually making yourself a great jig that allows your future dovetails to be that much easier to align and to do the job, especially if you're a beginner and you're struggling to align. This means that even if your boards move like they did when I was doing this, as you could see, it would have allowed me to align it much easier, and that was probably where the discrepancies in my dovetails came about. For a shop jig, this is going to do the job. It doesn't have to be pretty, as long as it's functional and held at 90 degrees with a fence to allow you to do your alignment. So if you like this video and you'd like to see some more shop jigs, check out this video down here. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider liking and subscribing and checking me out on Patreon, and that is patreon.com/aussiewoodshed. And I'd like to give a big thanks to my current patrons on Patreon for their support, because without you it'd be a lot more difficult for me to do these videos. Bye for now.